The first time I saw the trail map, I didn't think much of it. The red line marking the route seemed straightforward, a loop through the hills, starting and ending at the same gravel lot. It was a cool morning, the kind that makes your breath puff white in the air. My boots were still stiff from lack of use, and the straps of my pack dug into my shoulders more than I'd remembered from my last hike. I told myself it was fine. The forecast said clear skies. The plan was simple: hike the loop, get back before sunset, drive home. The first mile passed quickly. The path was wide, the ground packed down hard from frequent use, and the trees on either side swayed gently in the breeze. Dry leaves crunched under my boots, and I could hear a faint rush of water somewhere far below the slope to my right. Every now and then, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine needles and damp earth. But as the trail narrowed, I noticed fewer signs of people. The gravel gave way to packed dirt. Roots twisted across the path like thick ropes, forcing me to step carefully. The air felt cooler here, with less sunlight breaking through the canopy overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against a tree, the sound sharp and hollow. I checked my watch. I'd been walking for about an hour. According to the map, the next section would climb steadily for a while before leveling out along a ridge. I took a sip of water, adjusted my pack, and kept moving. The incline was gradual at first, then steeper. My breathing grew heavier, the strap of my pack rubbing against my collarbone in a way that was starting to sting. Sweat gathered under my shirt, dampening the fabric along my back. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. The woodpecker was gone, and even the breeze seemed to have faded. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the steady thump of my pulse in my ears. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the trail markers nailed to the trees. Small squares of faded paint, spaced far apart. Each time I spotted one, I felt a small wave of reassurance. It wasn't until I reached a fork in the trail that I realized something was wrong. According to the map, there wasn't supposed to be a split here. Both paths looked equally worn, both disappearing into the dense trees. There was no marker, no signpost. I stood there for a moment, trying to remember the last marker I'd seen. It must have been at least 15 minutes back. I didn't want to turn around, not when the ridge section should be close. The right-hand path looked slightly wider, so I took it. Almost immediately, the ground felt different under my boots. Softer, less compacted. A few minutes in, the trail began to slope down instead of up. That wasn't right. I hesitated, pulling out my phone to check my GPS. The signal flickered, then disappeared completely. Just the empty outline of the map. No blue dot to show where I was. I stuffed the phone back into my pocket, telling myself I'd just backtrack to the fork and try the other way. The fork came faster than I expected, which made me uneasy. On the way down, it had felt longer, but going back took less than 5 minutes. I pushed the thought away and took the other path. This one climbed sharply, the kind of incline that made my thighs burn and my breath come in short bursts. I leaned forward, planting my boots firmly with each step, gripping low branches to keep my balance. I must have walked like that for nearly 40 minutes before I realized I still hadn't reached the ridge. The trail was getting narrower, the brush on either side creeping closer until I had to push through it with my arms. Twigs scratched at my forearms. A branch caught on the strap of my pack and yanked me backward hard enough to make me stumble. Then I saw it. A fallen tree blocking the path, its trunk thick and slick with moss. I stepped closer, pressing a hand against it for balance as I climbed over. The wood felt damp and soft under my palm, and a piece of bark crumbled away, revealing a network of pale insects underneath. I hurried over, brushing my hand on my pants. On the other side, the path dipped down into a shallow gully. Water pooled in places, the mud sucking at my boots with each step. My socks were damp now, the cold seeping through to my toes. The sun had shifted behind clouds, dimming the light. I glanced at my watch, almost noon. I needed to reach the ridge soon or risk not making it back before dark. The gully ended in another steep climb. Halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath and realized how silent it was again. Not a single bird, not even the rustle of leaves. just the faint sound of my own breathing and the slow drip of water somewhere behind me. When I finally reached the top, the trail leveled out briefly before turning into a sharp drop. At the bottom was a narrow wooden bridge spanning a creek. The boards looked weathered, some sagging in the middle. I stepped onto it cautiously, feeling it shift under my weight. The water below moved quickly, churning around rocks, the current stronger than I'd expected. Across the bridge, the trail climbed again. My legs were beginning to ache. I told myself once I reached the ridge, I'd take a long break, eat something, and check my bearings. But the trail kept winding up and up until I lost all sense of distance. The air grew colder. My hands were stiff now, my fingers tingling. When the ground finally leveled out, I expected to see an open view, the ridge stretching out with the valley below. Instead, I found myself in a dense thicket of trees, the trail vanishing into shadows. My chest tightened. I should have been somewhere open by now. I should have been able to see the sky. I stopped, pulled out the map again, and tried to match the curves of the trail to where I was. Nothing fit. I didn't recognize any of it. My mouth felt dry, even though I'd been drinking water. A cold unease settled in my stomach. I turned around to retrace my steps and froze. The trail behind me didn't look the same. The brush I'd pushed through seemed thicker, the ground softer, as if no one had walked there in years. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. That was when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, far off but distinct. Not an animal. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I tightened my grip on the straps of my pack and forced myself to move, quickening my pace. The sound faded for a moment, then came again, matching my speed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until my legs burned. When I reached the bridge again, I didn't slow down. The boards groaned under me, but I didn't care. I took the climb on the other side in long, desperate strides. At the top, I turned left instead of right, hoping it would loop back to the main trail. But the ground sloped downward sharply, the dirt loose under my boots. I half slid, half ran until I reached a wide, shallow stream. The water was icy. I waded across, my feet going numb. On the far side, I followed what looked like a faint trail, but it soon faded into nothing. My breathing was ragged now, each inhale sharp in my throat. I stopped, listening. The footsteps were gone. The only sound was the stream behind me. I stood there for a long moment, trying to decide whether to turn back or keep going. My legs were trembling, partly from the cold, partly from exhaustion. Finally, I decided to follow the stream downhill, figuring it might lead to a road or campsite. The water twisted through the trees, sometimes widening into pools, sometimes narrowing into rocky channels. I walked along the bank, stepping over roots and ducking under branches. After what felt like an hour, I saw a glint of something metallic ahead. A signpost, rusted and leaning, half hidden by tall grass. The paint was faded, but I could just make out the words "Trailhead 2 miles." Relief washed over me so hard I almost laughed. I turned toward the direction the arrow pointed and started walking. The path here was barely visible, overgrown with weeds, but it was a path. My feet ached. My calves felt like they were made of lead, but I kept going. The light was fading now, the air colder still. By the time I reached the gravel lot, my hands were numb, and my shoulders ached from carrying the pack. My car was the only one left. I tossed my gear into the back seat, climbed in, and sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, just breathing. I didn't look back at the trail. I didn't want to see if anyone was standing there. I remember the day I set out on that trail like it was yesterday, even though it's been years since I survived it. The memory sticks with me, clear and raw, and I can still feel the dirt under my nails, the sweat trickling down my back, and the weight of the pack that seemed heavier with every step. That hike was supposed to be a simple trip, just me, my gear, and the wilderness. No one else. I wanted solitude, but what I found was something far worse than loneliness. It started early in the morning. I woke up just before dawn in my small apartment, my backpack already packed from the night before. I had planned this hike for months, studying maps, packing my supplies carefully. I was heading into the backcountry of the Cascade Mountains, a well-known but remote trail that stretched for miles. I chose it because it wasn't crowded, and I was used to hiking alone. I trusted my skills. The first hours of the hike were easy enough. The trail wound through tall pine trees, sunlight spilling through the branches in long golden beams. The air was cool and fresh. I felt alive. I walked at a steady pace, stopping only to sip water and eat small snacks I had packed. My pack weighed about 30 pounds, enough to carry all the essentials: water, food, first aid kit, extra clothes, a small tent, and a sleeping bag. As the morning wore on, the trail began to climb steeply. The forest thinned out and the trees became sparser. I passed a small creek that gurgled quietly, the sound soothing. The ground was rocky and uneven, but I was careful with every step. I was alone, but I didn't feel afraid. I was experienced. Around midday, I reached a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I sat on a large rock to rest, taking in the panorama. The mountains rose on the other side, their peaks capped with snow. I checked my map and my GPS device to confirm my location. Everything was going according to plan. After a short break, I continued. The trail became less defined as I climbed higher. Some sections were little more than narrow paths carved through scrub and boulders. I felt a strange shift in the air. It grew heavier, almost oppressive. The wind had picked up, and dark clouds began rolling in from the west. I ignored it, thinking it was just a passing weather change. By late afternoon, the trail led me into a dense forest. The trees here were older and taller, their thick branches forming a nearly solid canopy overhead. The light dimmed, and the temperature dropped. I pulled on my jacket and pressed forward. The path was harder to follow now, littered with fallen leaves and broken branches. I had to watch closely for the trail markers. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. I saw footprints, not mine, but someone else's. At first, I thought it was other hikers who had passed by recently. But the prints were odd, larger than mine, and they didn't follow the trail exactly. They seemed to weave back and forth, as if the person had been wandering or searching for something. I kept moving, but I felt my heart start to beat faster. I stopped several times to listen. The forest was still except for the sound of my boots on the soft earth and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself I was just imagining things. The clouds thickened and the sky darkened. Rain began to fall in light drops. I put on my rain jacket and pushed on, trying to make it to my planned campsite before nightfall. The trail was steep, and my legs burned from the climb. My boots slipped on wet rocks. Then I heard it a crack, sharp and sudden, from somewhere off the trail to my left. I froze, heart pounding. The sound could have been a branch breaking under an animal's weight, but it was too loud, too close. I held my breath and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. I started walking again, faster now. The rain turned heavier, cold drops soaking through my clothes despite my jacket. The trail became muddy, slippery. I lost my footing once, sliding down a short slope before catching myself on a tree root. As evening approached, I found the clearing where I planned to camp. It was a small, flat area near a bend in a slow-moving stream. I set up my tent quickly, my fingers numb from the cold and wet. Inside, I unrolled my sleeping bag and tried to dry off. I was exhausted but relieved to be out of the rain. I lay inside the tent, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the nylon roof. The forest was quiet except for the water. I tried to calm myself, but a tight knot of unease twisted in my stomach. The footprints I had seen earlier, the strange noises, something was off. I forced myself to eat a little and drank some water. My phone had no signal, but I had a GPS beacon with me for emergencies. I checked the battery, still full. I told myself I was safe here, that no one else was near. But sleep didn't come easy. Suddenly, a sound outside made me sit up. Something was moving in the trees. Branches cracked, leaves rustled. I shone my flashlight toward the noise. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow slipping between the trunks. My breath caught. I zipped the tent closed and pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin. I listened. The sounds stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the unease stayed. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jump. Hours passed like this. I never fully rested. At dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The forest was still and cold. I packed up quickly and started hiking down the trail. That's when I saw it, the footprints again. They were closer now, circling around the clearing where I had camped. The prints showed signs of dragging, like something heavy had been pulled through the mud. I followed the trail with my eyes, tracing it back toward the forest. My skin prickled. I decided not to wait for any more signs and started walking faster, descending the mountain. I was soaked, tired, and anxious. My mind raced with questions. Who else had been here? What were they looking for? By midday, the trail leveled out near a small abandoned cabin I had read about on the map. It was overgrown and weathered, with broken windows and a sagging roof. I thought about using it as a shelter if the weather turned bad again. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly open. That made my heart race. I shined my flashlight inside. The cabin was empty but looked like someone had been there recently. A small fire pit outside with cold ashes, some discarded cans, and a makeshift bed of old blankets. The idea that someone else had been here, maybe even hiding, unnerved me. I stayed only a few minutes before continuing down the trail. I was determined to reach the ranger station at the end of the trail before dark. The afternoon passed slowly. The trail was less steep now, winding through thick woods and over rocky outcrops. I kept an eye out for any sign of people. Late in the afternoon, I heard voices. Not words, just distant shouts and shouting. My heart jumped. The voices sounded angry, rough. They echoed through the trees. I froze, trying to listen. The sounds were coming from the direction of the cabin I had just passed. My mind raced. Were those the same people who had left the footprints? I didn't want to find out. I moved quickly away from that area, keeping low and trying to stay quiet. The sun dipped below the trees, and shadows lengthened. I pushed harder, knowing I didn't have much daylight left. Then, near a bend in the trail, I heard something that made me stop cold. A loud crash, like a tree or large branch falling. It came from the woods just off the path. I looked around frantically. The forest was dense and dark now. The air felt thick and heavy. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt sweat run down my back despite the chill. I took out my phone and tried again for signal. Nothing. My GPS beacon was still working, but I hadn't sent any alerts. I didn't want to panic yet. I kept moving, but every step felt heavier. Then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trail ahead. Tall, wearing dark clothes that blended with the night. The figure didn't move. I froze. My breath caught. It didn't say anything. Didn't move toward me. Just stood there, blocking the path. I thought about going around, but the forest was too thick. There was no clear way through. I swallowed hard, feeling panic rise. Then the figure stepped aside slowly, disappearing back into the trees. I didn't wait. I ran past the spot, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I kept running until I saw lights ahead, the ranger station. I burst through the doors, soaked, shaking, and breathless. The rangers looked surprised but helped me inside immediately. I told them everything, pointing to the footprints and describing the figure. They told me the area was known for illegal hunters and poachers who sometimes lived rough in the woods, hiding from the law. They said I was lucky to be safe. I spent the night in the ranger station, warm and fed, still shaken. The next day, I left the mountains behind, vowing never to return alone. I learned that some dangers in the wild aren't animals or weather, but other people. The morning was colder than I expected. I stepped out of my small rented cabin, the early sun barely filtering through thick clouds. The air was crisp, sharp, and smelled like wet pine and earth. I'd driven a long way the night before to get here, to this small trailhead deep in a forest I barely knew, hoping for a quiet day away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz in my mind. I wanted to hike, to lose myself in the trees, the rocks, and the dirt under my boots. I adjusted my backpack, which felt heavier than usual, packed with water, some food, a first aid kit, my phone, and a map I had printed out the day before. I checked the compass on my watch, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the trail. The first few miles were peaceful, almost too peaceful. The forest was thick on either side, tall trees with dark trunks and thick branches forming a canopy that filtered the light. The trail was narrow, rocky, and winding, with roots that seemed to reach out like fingers along the path. I had to watch my step carefully, but the uneven ground felt good under my boots. It was exactly the kind of hiking I wanted, challenging but doable. As I went deeper, the trail became less marked. I had to stop more often to check the map and my compass. The forest around me grew denser, the trees closer together, and the underbrush thicker. The quiet was almost complete, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call or rustle in the bushes. After about 3 hours, I came to a small clearing. The sky was now mostly clear, sunlight reaching through the branches and warming the ground. I stopped to drink some water and eat a quick snack. I looked at the map again and figured I was halfway through the loop I planned. I felt good, tired but strong. Then I saw something. A piece of orange plastic caught on a branch near the edge of the clearing. It looked like a piece of tape or a trail marker, but it wasn't on my map. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on dry leaves, and saw it was part of a surveyor's tape. Bright orange with faded writing I couldn't quite make out. I paused, feeling a flicker of unease. This wasn't a hiking trail marking. Survey tape usually meant construction or research. I wondered why it was here, so deep in the forest. I turned back to the map and my compass. The tape was near the edge of a steep slope marked on the map as a cliff. I decided not to go that way, sticking to the marked path. I kept walking, but the feeling of being watched grew. I scanned the trees, the shadows, but saw nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. About an hour later, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed the path splitting, but here the signpost was missing. The survey tape reappeared tied to a low branch, leading down the left fork. The right fork had no markers. I checked my compass. According to my plan, I needed to take the right fork, the one without tape. But the tape looked fresh, bright against the dull forest colors, and I wondered if the path had changed recently. I hesitated. Then I convinced myself to trust the map. I took the right path. The trail grew narrower and harder to follow. The underbrush scraped my legs through my pants. The trees were older, thicker, and their branches blocked out more sunlight. The ground felt damp. I stepped carefully, occasionally glancing back to make sure I wasn't losing the trail. Then, suddenly, I noticed something wrong. The trail had disappeared. The dirt beneath my feet turned to thick roots and moss-covered stones. I looked up and around. The trees closed in like walls, the canopy above so dense I could barely see the sky. I reached for my phone to check GPS, but the signal was gone. No service. I cursed under my breath and pulled out my map and compass again. I tried to orient myself. According to the map, I should be near a small creek that ran through the forest, but I couldn't hear any water. Instead, there was a strange silence, heavier than before, as if the forest was holding its breath. I decided to backtrack, retracing my steps to the fork. I turned around carefully, marking landmarks: a large mossy rock, a twisted tree to find the way back. But the trail wasn't where I expected. The landscape didn't match the map anymore. The rock wasn't where I thought it would be. The twisted tree was missing. I tried again, moving slowly, using the compass, trying to keep my bearings. But every step seemed to take me deeper into the forest, not closer to the trail. Panic started to rise in my chest. I stopped to catch my breath and sat on a fallen log. I told myself to stay calm. I had a knife, water, food, and matches. I could survive here for a while if needed. I took a sip of water and looked around. The forest seemed to change with every glance. The moss on the trees looked thicker. The shadows stretched longer, darker. Time passed, but I couldn't tell how long. The sun disappeared behind clouds, and the sky grew darker. I stood up and decided to keep moving, hoping to find the creek or the trail or anything familiar. As I walked, I heard a sound, soft, rustling, but not from the trees. Something was moving nearby. I froze. The sound stopped. I moved again, slower this time, watching and listening. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps. Not my own. I stopped, heart pounding. I tried to look between the trees, but the forest was too thick. I couldn't see anything. The footsteps got closer. I stepped off the path and hid behind a tree. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. The footsteps faded. I looked around. Nothing. I decided not to risk staying put. I moved quickly, trying to put distance between me and whoever or whatever was nearby. The forest was twisting now, unfamiliar and strange. I kept walking until I found a small stream. Relief flooded me. I knew from the map that the creek ran near the main trail. I followed the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me out. As the light faded, I realized I was unprepared for night in the forest. I had no flashlight, only my phone, which was dead. I started gathering sticks and dry leaves to build a small fire. It was difficult in the damp air, but after several tries, I managed to get a flame. The fire was small but enough to keep me warm and visible. I wrapped myself in my jacket and sat down, listening to the night sounds. I felt uneasy but tried to sleep. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. I jumped up, eyes wide. The sound came from the direction of the creek. I grabbed my knife and moved toward the sound. The forest was dark, the firelight flickering behind me. I saw movement. A figure, a man, crouching near the water, his face shadowed. He didn't speak. I didn't either. He stood and walked away quickly, disappearing into the trees. My mind raced. Who was he? What was he doing here? Was he following me? Was he dangerous? I hurried back to the fire, packed up, and decided to move again. I walked upstream, hoping to find the trail. Hours passed. My legs ached. My clothes were wet from the creek, and my water was almost gone. I stumbled onto the trail just before dawn. Exhausted, soaked, and scared, I followed the path back to the parking lot. When I reached my car, the relief was overwhelming. I locked the doors, sat down, and took deep breaths. Later, I learned from park rangers that the area I had wandered into was sometimes used by illegal hunters and trespassers. The survey tape I saw was probably related to their traps or markings. The man I saw was likely one of them. That day, I learned how easy it was to get lost, how little control I really had in the wilderness, and how important it was to trust my instincts and be prepared for anything. I never went back to that forest, and I always double-check maps and trail markers now. It started as just another hike. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. I needed a break from the noise of the city, from the constant buzz of work emails, from people. I wanted the silence of the forest, the rhythm of my own footsteps on the dirt trail, the scent of pine and wet earth filling my lungs. The trail I chose was not well known, tucked away in a part of the national forest I had only heard about in passing. It was the kind of place where few people went, and that's exactly what I wanted. I packed my backpack the night before carefully. Water bottles, snacks, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a compass, a map printed from the forest website, a lightweight rain jacket, and a whistle. I didn't expect trouble, but I was always cautious. Hiking alone was something I enjoyed, but I respected the outdoors and knew things could go wrong. The morning was cool but clear, a soft gray sky with the promise of sun breaking through. I parked my car at the small dirt lot near the trailhead. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. I adjusted my pack, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the narrow path. First, the trail was easy. The ground was firm, mostly dirt with patches of pine needles, scattered rocks, and roots. The trees were tall and close together, their branches forming a loose canopy overhead. I could hear a distant stream somewhere off to the right, the water tinkling quietly over rocks. I kept walking, the steady crunch of my boots on the ground comforting. The further I went, the more the trail narrowed. The trees grew thicker, and the underbrush closed in around me. Small plants, ferns, and moss covered everything in shades of green and brown. The forest floor was damp from recent rains, and the smell of wet wood and leaves was strong. My footsteps became softer as the soil gave way to patches of moss and softer earth. I reached a fork in the trail about 2 hours in. The map showed both paths leading deeper into the forest, but one was marked as less traveled. I chose the less traveled path, feeling adventurous and wanting to avoid the few hikers who might be on the other route. The trail became rougher, more uneven, with rocks jutting out here and there and tree roots twisting across the path. I had to watch my step carefully. Time passed quietly. I stopped occasionally to drink water or check the map. The sun had come out, filtering through the trees and casting moving patches of light on the ground. Birds called above, and every now and then I saw a squirrel dart through the branches. I felt at peace, but after a while something began to shift. The forest seemed to grow quieter. The birds stopped singing, the wind dropped. Even the distant stream faded until I could no longer hear it. The air grew colder, though the sun still shone. Shadows deepened under the trees. I came to a small clearing. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and pine needles. There was a large rock at the edge, and I sat down to rest. I pulled out a snack and ate slowly, watching the forest around me. Felt too still, too quiet. No birds, no wind, no insects. I glanced at my watch. It was just afternoon. I decided to push on. The trail ahead looked narrow and winding, disappearing into thicker trees. After the clearing, the trail became even less distinct. The ground was softer, covered in moss, and the underbrush was thick. It felt as though the forest itself was closing in around me. I found myself ducking under low branches and stepping carefully over tangled roots. At one point, I almost missed a narrow path veering off to the left. It was barely visible, overgrown with bushes and small trees. I checked the map again. This wasn't marked as a trail, but the main trail seemed to bend sharply to the left here, and this path roughly matched that direction. I decided to follow it. Something about the old, forgotten path intrigued me. It felt like a secret the forest was keeping. The undergrowth grew thicker, and the path was rough but manageable. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward, grabbing a tree trunk to steady myself. My foot had slipped into a hole hidden by leaves and moss. It wasn't deep, maybe a foot, but enough to make me lose balance. I pulled my foot out and peered inside. The hole was narrow and looked natural, like a burrow or an animal den, but it was oddly shaped, almost like a trap. I looked around carefully but saw nothing else like it. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just an animal's home, and continued on. The forest grew darker as the trees thickened overhead. I realized I had been walking for over an hour without seeing a clear landmark. The trail was faint, and my feet were wet from brushing through damp plants. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't check GPS. I pulled out my compass and tried to figure out my position. I was supposed to be heading north, but the compass needle swung erratically, and I felt disoriented. I slowed down, paying attention to each step. The forest felt different here. The trees were older, bigger, their bark rough and covered in lichen. The air was damp and heavy. I noticed broken branches and flattened grass patches near the trail. It looked like something or someone had been here recently. A sudden noise made me freeze. It was a low rustling, like something moving through the bushes nearby. I stopped breathing and turned slowly, trying to see what it was. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pushed forward, but the feeling only grew stronger. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps or twigs snapping behind me, but when I stopped and looked, there was nothing there. The trail became steeper, winding up a small hill. The trees thinned out a little, and I could see patches of sky. I climbed carefully, using my hands to steady myself on rocks and roots. At the top of the hill, I found a small ridge with a good view of the forest below. The sunlight poured through the clouds in golden beams, making the green trees sparkle. I took a deep breath, feeling some relief. But as I looked around, I noticed something unsettling. Far in the distance, near the edge of the forest, a small plume of smoke rose slowly into the sky. It was thin and gray, not like a campfire, but more like something burning, maybe wood or brush. I frowned. I hadn't seen any campsites marked on the map near here, and no one else was supposed to be on this trail. The smoke was too thin to be from a wildfire, but it still didn't feel right. I checked my watch again. I had been hiking for almost 6 hours. My legs were tired. My water was running low. I considered turning back, but I also thought I should investigate the smoke. It might be someone in trouble. I started descending the ridge toward the smoke. The forest here was different, more open, with patches of grass and wildflowers. The ground was uneven, with rocks and roots hidden beneath the plants. As I got closer, the smell of smoke grew stronger. It was sharp and acrid, mixed with the scent of burning pine. I realized the fire was recent, maybe even still burning somewhere nearby. The underbrush here was trampled, and I saw footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, bigger than mine, heavy boots. I felt a pang of fear. If someone else was here, why were they burning something? Was this a campfire or something else? I followed the footprints carefully. They led to a small clearing where the fire had been. The ground was blackened, and charred pieces of wood lay scattered. There were also scraps of torn fabric and some broken branches arranged strangely near the fire pit. I looked around, heart pounding. The forest was eerily silent again. No birds, no wind, no animals. Then something caught my eye. Near the edge of the clearing, a small bundle of sticks and leaves looked like it had been recently disturbed. I approached and saw a worn piece of paper partially buried in the dirt. I picked it up carefully. It was a map, crudely drawn, with markings and symbols I didn't recognize. There were circles and lines, arrows pointing in different directions. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever had been here wasn't just camping or hiking. This looked like something else, something planned. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I decided to leave the clearing quickly. As I turned to go, I heard the rustling again, louder this time. Came from the trees behind me. I froze. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes and a backpack. His face was partially hidden by a hood. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. I felt trapped, my heart racing. I slowly backed away, but he followed, moving silently through the trees. I reached for my whistle but stopped myself. I didn't want to startle him or cause trouble. Instead, I turned and ran. My legs moved faster than I thought possible. I stumbled over roots and rocks, branches scratching my arms and face. The man's footsteps echoed behind me, close but not right on me. I didn't look back. I focused on running downhill, hoping to find the main trail or my car. After what felt like I started my hike just after sunrise, the sky still carrying that pale, washed-out blue that comes before the sun really warms the air. The parking lot was empty except for my car. A few potholes filled with rainwater from the night before, and the dull sound of wind brushing through the trees. The trailhead sign was faded, splintering at the edges, but the arrow still pointed up into the narrow path between the pines. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves. My boots pressed into soft mud, leaving clean prints behind me that quickly blurred at the edges from the moisture. I liked starting early before anyone else was around when it was just me and the trail. There was something satisfying about the crunch of twigs and the rhythm of my steps in the stillness. The first part of the hike was easy. The trail wound gently uphill, wide enough for a small ATV, and bordered by moss-covered rocks. Sunlight started to break through the canopy in thin streaks, hitting the forest floor like spotlights. I could hear a stream somewhere to my right, the soft rushing sound mixing with the creak of trees swaying overhead. I felt good, steady breathing, no real strain yet. A little over an hour in, the trail narrowed, the dirt giving way to a mix of loose gravel and exposed roots. The incline sharpened. I stopped once to drink some water, feeling the cool liquid slide down my dry throat. The air here was colder, and the smell changed, less like mud, more like raw stone and pine sap. I noticed the forest had grown denser. The trees seemed taller here, older, their trunks wider than barrels. The light had dimmed again, the canopy closing tighter. I could hear my own breathing louder now, and my boots sounded heavier against the ground. About halfway up, I hit the first switchback. The path turned sharply, cutting across a steep slope. On one side, the hill rose sharply above my head. On the other, it dropped away fast into a tangle of undergrowth and shadow. The dirt here was looser, with small stones that shifted under my weight. I adjusted my pace, planting each step more carefully. I told myself I'd go another hour before stopping to eat. The air was thinner up here, the silence thicker. Even the sound of the stream had faded away somewhere below me. I kept climbing. After the second switchback, the trail became more uneven. Small landslides had eaten into parts of it, leaving narrow strips of walkable space with loose rock crumbling at the edges. I started feeling the first hints of unease. Not panic, just a prickling awareness of how isolated I was. I hadn't seen a single person all morning. The forest here felt old in a way that pressed against you, made you aware of how small you were inside it. By the third switchback, the air had gone completely still. No wind in the trees, no bird calls, just the faint sound of my boots and my breathing. The temperature seemed to have dropped too. My fingertips felt cold against my water bottle. I took another drink, noticing the condensation forming quickly on the plastic. I reached a part of the trail where the drop-off to my right became severe, 30, maybe 40 feet straight down into jagged rocks. The trail itself was barely 2 feet wide here. My left shoulder brushed against the hillside while my right foot was only inches from the edge. I slowed down, keeping my steps short and deliberate. 100 yards into this narrow stretch, I felt the first slip. A small rock rolled under my right boot, sending my ankle twisting just enough to jolt my balance. My heart jumped, and I instinctively leaned left into the hillside, catching myself. The loose gravel slid down the edge and disappeared into the drop below, clicking against rocks until I couldn't hear it anymore. That's when I noticed the trail ahead looked even worse. A section of it had collapsed entirely, leaving what was basically a 2-foot gap where the ground had given way. Beyond it, the path picked up again, but it looked even narrower. I crouched slightly, testing my weight, trying to figure out the safest way across. The first attempt failed. I placed my boot too close to the edge, and the dirt crumbled away under it. My stomach lurched, and I pulled back fast, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I took a step back, repositioned, and tried again, leaning hard toward the hill, almost scraping my shoulder against it as I stepped over. My right boot landed on solid ground, but a burst of loose stones shot down the drop. I made it across, but I could feel the strain in my calves from holding myself so tight. From here, the trail climbed faster, winding between boulders that jutted out of the hillside. My legs burned, and my breaths came faster. I could see patches of sunlight above where the trees thinned, and I told myself the top must be close. But then I came to another switchback, this one steeper than the rest, cutting sharply into a wall of rock. The trail here was just dirt pressed against the stone, with no real footing except for the occasional root or ledge. My boots kept sliding an inch or two with every step. My hands brushed the rock wall for balance, the stone cold and rough under my fingertips. Halfway up this section, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I realized I'd been hearing a faint rustling sound for the last minute or so. Behind me, maybe below me. I turned, scanning the trail I'd just come up. Nothing moved, no wind, no animals, just still trees and the sharp drop. My eyes stayed on the trail for a few seconds longer than they needed to, like I was waiting for something to move. Nothing did. I forced myself to keep climbing. The last switchback was the worst. The incline felt almost vertical, and my thighs shook with the effort. The soil here was darker, more compact, but slick with moisture. I had to dig the edges of my boots into it just to keep from sliding back. My water bottle was almost empty. Finally, the trail leveled out, opening into a narrow ridge. I could see the valley below, green and endless, the river like a silver thread winding through it. For a moment, I felt that quiet satisfaction again, that feeling you get when you push through the hard parts and earn the view. But standing there, looking out over the drop, I noticed something. The ridge was unstable. I could see small cracks in the dirt, the kind that come from slow erosion. The edges sloped down slightly, and the dirt under my boots felt softer than it should. I decided to head back immediately. The sun had shifted, and I knew the trail would be colder and darker on the way down. Going down was worse than coming up. My legs shook with every step, my boots sliding on loose rock. Every time I planted my foot, I tested it first, afraid the ground would give way. The narrow sections felt even tighter, the drop even steeper. By the time I reached the first landslide section, the air was colder, the light fading. My hands felt numb, and my throat was dry. I crossed the gap again, but this time a larger section of dirt broke away under my boot. I froze for a second, leaning hard into the hillside, my heart hammering. The sound of the dirt falling was long enough that I knew it hit far below. When I finally reached the wider trail near the bottom, my knees felt weak. My boots were caked in mud. My hands scraped from the rock. I kept walking until I saw the faded sign at the trailhead again, the parking lot just beyond. The relief hit all at once when I stepped onto the asphalt. My car sat exactly where I left it, quiet and still in the empty lot. I opened the door, slid inside, and just sat there for a minute, my hands still tight on the steering wheel even before I started the engine. It was only later, thinking about it, that the unease returned, not from what happened, but from how easily something could have happened. One slip on that ridge, one wrong step on the landslide section, no one else on the trail, no one to hear it, just me, a few inches from vanishing into the drop, with the forest swallowing the sound before it could reach anyone. I want to tell you about the time I went hiking alone in the remote parts of the Cascade Mountains. It was supposed to be just a simple solo trip, a chance to get away from everything and spend a few days in the wilderness, soaking up the quiet and fresh air. What I didn't expect was how quickly things would turn from peaceful to terrifying, and how close I came to losing everything, including my own life. The first morning started calm. I packed my bag the night before, double-checked all my gear, and left my car at the small trailhead parking lot early at dawn. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine trees surrounded me. I pulled on my hiking boots and tightened the laces before stepping onto the narrow dirt path that led into the dense forest. The trail was not popular. I'd only seen 2 other hikers during the entire day. That made me happy. I wanted solitude. I felt small compared to the giant trees around me, their trunks thick and bark rough under my fingertips as I passed. The moss covered the ground like a soft, green carpet, muffling the sound of my footsteps. The route climbed steadily at first. I passed several small streams, their clear water rushing over smooth stones. Birds chirped far above in the branches, and once, a squirrel dashed across the path, stopping briefly to look at me with curious eyes before disappearing into the underbrush. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley filled with thick forest. The view was breathtaking. The sun cast long shadows between the trees, and the sky was an endless blue. I stopped to eat a simple lunch, a sandwich, some trail mix, and water from my bottle. I filled up my water from a nearby spring that bubbled out of the rocks, careful to filter it before drinking. After lunch, I continued deeper into the woods, following the trail markers nailed to the trees. The path grew less defined as I went further in. The underbrush thickened, and the forest floor was covered with fallen branches and leaves. I had to watch every step to avoid twisting an ankle or stepping on something sharp. I set up my tent just before sunset in a small clearing near a creek. The place was quiet, with only the sound of water trickling over stones and the occasional rustling of leaves. I built a small fire, cooking a simple meal of dehydrated soup and rice. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and I felt safe. I cleaned up carefully, making sure to pack away any food so as not to attract animals. I went to bed early, wrapped in my sleeping bag as the night settled in. The stars were bright and clear, the kind of view you don't get in the city. I felt peaceful, almost as if the forest itself was watching over me. The next day started like the first, peaceful and quiet. I woke with the dawn, packed up camp, and began hiking again. The trail was harder now, steeper and rockier. My legs ached, but the fresh air pushed me onward. Around midday, I noticed the sky growing cloudy. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped quickly. I could feel rain coming. I pushed on, hoping to reach a ranger station marked on my map before the weather turned bad. By late afternoon, the rain started. First, it was just a few drops, then a steady downpour. The trail became slippery, the dirt turning to mud. My boots sank with every step, and my clothes quickly became soaked. I searched for shelter but found none. The forest around me grew darker, the trees twisting in the wind. I kept moving, trying to find the ranger station, but the map was getting hard to read in the rain. The trail markers were less frequent, and some were covered in moss or broken. After what felt like hours, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. The path was unfamiliar, and I didn't recognize any of the landmarks I had passed earlier. The rain was relentless now, turning cold and heavy. I felt the first real flicker of panic. I stopped to catch my breath, feeling water dripping down my face and pooling inside my jacket. My phone had no signal, no surprise in such a remote place, and the battery was already low. I pulled out my compass, but the rain made it hard to focus on the needle. I tried to remember the direction I had come from. As night fell, the forest became a shadowy maze. The rain slowed but didn't stop, and the temperature dropped further. I set up my emergency bivvy under a large fallen tree. It was an ideal shelter, but it kept some of the rain off me. The cold seeped into my bones as I tried to sleep. My fingers were numb, and the dampness made it hard to rest. I tried to stay calm, thinking about what I would do in the morning. The next day, the sky was gray but not raining. I broke camp quickly, trying to keep moving while I had light. My clothes were still wet from the day before, and my boots squished with every step. The trail was muddy and slippery, and I was exhausted. I followed what I thought was the trail, but it was faint and overgrown. I had to push through thick bushes and duck under low branches. At one point, I slipped on a moss-covered rock and twisted my ankle. The pain was sharp and immediate, but I forced myself to stand and keep moving. By midday, I realized the injury was serious. My ankle swelled and throbbed, and I could barely put weight on it. I found a large branch to use as a walking stick and moved slowly, trying to conserve energy. I knew I needed help. I thought about trying to hike back to the trailhead, but my ankle made that impossible. I sat down, taking off my backpack and checking my supplies. My food was running low, and the water in my bottle was almost gone. I drank the last of it, then looked around for a water source. I spotted a small stream nearby and filtered some water, careful not to drink anything that looked murky or stagnant. The forest around me was silent except for the gentle flow of the stream. I tried to calm my racing mind. I knew panic wouldn't help, but the isolation was starting to get to me. The trees seemed to close in, and every sound was amplified in the stillness. As the day wore on, I considered my options. I had a basic first aid kit and could tape my ankle for some support, but I didn't know how far I was from help, and the thought of staying here overnight alone was terrifying. I decided to try to hike to higher ground, hoping that maybe cell signal would return if I climbed up the ridge. I moved slowly, leaning heavily on my makeshift crutch. Hours passed, and I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the forest. I pulled out my phone, and to my relief, a single bar of signal appeared. I quickly sent a text to a friend with my location coordinates and a message saying I needed help. I rested there, watching the sun begin to set behind the mountains. The temperature dropped quickly, and I wrapped myself in my emergency blanket. That night was the hardest. The cold crept into my bones, and my ankle burned with pain. I tried to keep warm by doing small movements and breathing deeply. Every noise, a snapping twig, the distant call of an owl, made my heart race. I thought about how easy it would have been to give up. The forest was huge and unforgiving, and no one knew exactly where I was. but the thought of my family, my life back home, kept me going. When morning came, I was weak but determined. I stayed near the outcrop, hoping rescue would come. The sun rose slowly, casting golden light on the trees. A few hours later, I heard the sound of voices and footsteps. I waved my arms frantically until a group of hikers spotted me and called for help. They had a radio and contacted the park rangers. Within an hour, a rescue team arrived, carrying medical supplies and a stretcher. They carefully lifted me and began the slow journey back to safety. Back at the hospital, I learned my ankle was badly sprained but would heal with time. The doctors praised me for staying calm and using my emergency skills. The whole experience changed me. I realized how important it is to be prepared, to respect nature's power, and to never underestimate how quickly things can go wrong. I still hike, but now I always make sure someone knows my plans. I carry extra supplies, and I'm never alone in the wilderness. The forest isn't scary because of ghosts or monsters. It's scary because it's wild and unpredictable, and it doesn't care if you're ready or not. You have to respect it, or it will teach you the hard way. I had been hiking for years, so when I planned that solo trip in late September, I didn't think twice about it. The trail I chose was considered moderate, not too remote, but still far enough from towns that cell service was patchy. The idea was to leave early in the morning, follow the ridge for most of the day, and set up camp in a clearing I had marked on my map. I packed light but carefully tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra layers, food for 2 days, water, filter, and the usual safety gear. The morning started off perfect. The air was cool, with a thin layer of mist clinging to the lower valleys. I could smell the wet leaves and damp soil as I stepped out of my car and locked it at the trailhead. My boots crunched against the gravel, and the sound of running water from a nearby creek filled the silence. I adjusted my backpack straps and began walking. The first mile was easy-packed dirt, gentle incline, and only a few rocks to step over. As the sun rose higher, the fog burned away, revealing bright colors in the trees. The maples were red, the birches a golden yellow, and the evergreens stood dark and steady among them. The trail curved along the side of a hill, sometimes narrowing so much I had to step carefully to avoid sliding down the slope. My breathing was steady, and my legs felt strong. It felt good to be away from noise, just hearing wind move through the branches. 2 hours in, I stopped for water. I crouched beside a boulder, drinking slowly, and checked my map. I was still on track. The ridge section was up ahead, which would be the most exposed part. I figured I'd be there in another hour and then descend into a quieter forest where I'd make camp. When I reached the ridge, the wind picked up, pushing against my jacket and making my pack feel heavier. The path here was rocky, uneven, with loose gravel that shifted under my boots. I slowed down, planting each step firmly. On my left was a steep drop into the valley, maybe 150 feet down. On my right, jagged rocks rose above me, streaked with moss and lichen. I kept my eyes on the trail, moving steadily. After a while, I noticed something that made me pause. There were no more footprints ahead of me. Earlier, I'd seen faint impressions from hiking boots in the dirt. Other people had come this way in the past few days, but here, on this section, the ground was untouched except for small animal tracks. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe the wind and loose stones had erased the marks. I pushed on, following the trail as it curved toward a denser patch of trees. The air felt still here, almost muffled. My boots sank slightly into soft dirt instead of scraping on rock. I kept checking my map and compass, making sure I was still heading in the right direction. Everything seemed fine until I came to a fork. This was strange. There wasn't supposed to be a fork. The trail on the map was a single continuous line. Yet in front of me, one path veered left, descending into darker forest, while the other went straight ahead but looked rougher and less worn. I stood there for a full minute, listening. No sound of voices, no distant dogs, nothing but my own breathing. I decided to go straight, figuring it was the main route. At first, it seemed right. The trail matched the compass bearing. But after about half an hour, the ground started to change. It became uneven, more like a dried stream bed than a hiking trail. The rocks were slick in spots, and small pools of water collected in dips. My pace slowed. When I checked the map again, I realized I might have drifted off the marked route. The terrain here didn't match what I'd studied. I looked back, thinking about turning around, but something about the way the light hit the trees made it harder to tell which way I'd come from. The shadows were long now, stretching across the ground. I took a deep breath and decided to keep moving forward. If the trail kept heading east, I could eventually loop back toward the marked path. The problem was the forest grew denser and the slope became steeper. My calves burned from the effort, and I had to grab at tree trunks to keep from sliding. At one point, I came to a fallen tree huge and covered in moss. It blocked the way entirely. I had to climb over, careful not to slip on the damp surface. On the other side, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A piece of old, torn fabric snagged on a branch. It was faded, maybe once bright, but now almost gray. It looked like it had been there for years. I told myself it was probably from a jacket or backpack someone lost long ago. Still, I found myself glancing around more often, scanning the trees. The light was starting to fade. I needed to find a flat spot to camp before it got too dark. I finally found only small clearing with enough space to set up my tent. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and got to work. The routine helped settle my nerves. I staked the tent, unrolled the sleeping bag, and boiled some water for a simple meal. The air grew colder, and the forest sounds changed. Birds quieted down, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I tried to eat slowly, but I kept feeling like I needed to finish before it got fully dark. The shadows closed in quickly, and soon my headlamp was the only light. That's when I noticed something else: no stars. The sky above the trees was just black. Clouds must have rolled in without me noticing. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and lay back, listening. At first, it was only the wind. Then, faintly, I heard a sound like dry leaves being stepped on. It was slow, irregular. I froze, holding my breath. After a while, it stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal and eventually drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to silence. No wind, no insects, nothing. The air felt heavy, and I could hear my own heartbeat. I stayed still for a long time, staring at the dim fabric of the tent. Eventually, I fell asleep again. When morning came, I packed quickly. I wanted to get back to the main trail as soon as possible. My plan was to head northeast until I hit the ridge again. I started walking, keeping a steady pace, but the forest here felt different. The trees were thicker, the ground softer, and there was no sign of a trail at all now. Hours passed. My legs ached, and my water was running low. I stopped by a small stream to refill, filtering carefully. That's when I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. A boot print in the mud. Not fresh, but clear enough to see the tread pattern. Pointed in the opposite direction I'd been going. I turned around, following it. Soon I saw more prints, some faint, some sharp, leading uphill. My pace quickened. I hoped they would take me back to the ridge. But the higher I climbed, the more the forest seemed to twist. The slope forced me to zigzag, and I kept losing sight of the prints. By late afternoon, my legs were shaking from exhaustion. I came to another clearing, smaller than the one I'd camped in. In the middle was a fire ring made of stones, blackened from use. There were no fresh ashes, but it was clear someone had camped here before. I set my pack down and rested. As I sat there, I realized I had two options: stay the night again and try in the morning, or keep going until I found the trail. I chose to keep moving. That decision nearly cost me. I never thought hiking alone could become one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had done plenty of solo hikes before. Some were easy, some were challenging, but nothing had ever left me as shaken as what happened on this trip. It started on a bright morning in late September. The air had that crispness that only comes after summer begins to fade. I had planned this hike for months, just me, my backpack, and a trail deep into a national forest I'd never explored. The forest was known for its rugged terrain and dense woods. The trail was supposed to be about 15 miles one way, taking you deep into a remote wilderness area where very few people ever went. I was excited for the challenge and the quiet. I parked my car at the small trailhead, which looked like a clearing more than a parking lot. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles. The trees around were tall and straight, mostly fir and pine, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The sun filtered through the leaves and patches, making the forest floor a mix of light and shadow. I checked my pack one last time: water, food, map, compass, a headlamp, a knife, first aid kit, and extra clothes. Everything was there. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail wound through the trees, occasionally crossing small streams and patches of moss-covered rocks. I loved the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional chirp of birds hidden high above. The air smelled fresh, mixed with pine resin and damp earth. I kept a steady pace, stopping only for short breaks to drink water and take pictures of the scenery. After about 4 hours, I reached a fork in the trail. According to the map, the right fork led to a scenic viewpoint overlooking a valley, and the left fork continued deeper into the forest towards a small abandoned mining camp that I wanted to see. The viewpoint was tempting, but I decided to push onward to the mining camp. I was feeling good and wanted to make the most of the day. As I followed the left fork, the trail became less clear. The ground was uneven, and roots snaked across the path. The trees grew closer together, and the forest felt darker, even though the sun was still high. I slowed down, paying attention to the map and compass. The map was old, and the trail wasn't maintained regularly, so I expected some rough spots. The silence around me grew deeper as I moved further away from the popular areas. There were no other hikers in sight, no sounds of cars or human activity. The forest was alive with nature sounds: birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, but they were subtle. I liked this kind of solitude. It made me feel connected to the wilderness. About 2 hours later, I saw the first signs of the mining camp: broken wooden beams, rusted metal scraps, and an old, half-collapsed cabin. It looked like no one had been there for decades. I explored carefully, walking around the ruins, imagining the people who once lived and worked here. The place had a strange quietness to it, not peaceful, but heavy, like time had stopped. I took photos, made notes in my journal, and ate some snacks. I stayed longer than I planned because the spot fascinated me. But after a while, I knew I had to turn back. The sun was dipping lower now, and I wanted to reach a camping spot I had marked near the trailhead before dark. On my way back, I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail had become even less visible. The forest floor was covered with fallen leaves now, hiding the path. The map showed a small creek that I could use as a landmark, so I headed in that direction. I figured following the creek downstream would eventually bring me back to the main trail. As I walked alongside the creek, the air grew cooler and damper. The sky was turning orange and purple as the sun set behind the hills. The forest became shadowy, and the trees cast long, dark shapes across the ground. I switched on my headlamp and adjusted my backpack straps. The sound of running water was comforting, but I noticed that the creek was shallower than I expected. The ground was soft and muddy in places, making every step tricky. I was moving cautiously, paying attention to my footing. Suddenly, I felt the ground shift under my left foot. Before I could react, I slipped on a wet rock and twisted my ankle badly. A sharp pain shot through my leg. I fell hard onto the muddy ground, my head hitting a rock. I lay there for a moment, stunned and trying to catch my breath. The pain in my ankle was intense. I tried to stand, but the pain was too much. I realized I had seriously injured myself and couldn't walk properly. Panic started to rise in my chest. I was alone, deep in the woods, far from any help. My phone had no signal as I expected in this remote area. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. I knew I had to think clearly. The sun was almost gone, and darkness would come quickly. I rummaged through my backpack and found my first aid kit. I pulled out an elastic bandage and wrapped my ankle as best as I could to reduce swelling and provide some support. I tried hopping a few steps, but it was exhausting and painful. The creek wasn't wide, but the muddy banks made moving slow. I realized I had to find a better place to spend the night before the cold set in. I scanned the area with my headlamp and spotted a small clearing with a few dry patches and some fallen logs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than staying right next to the muddy creek. I hobbled over and began setting up my emergency bivy sack and tarp. I was glad I always carried these, even on day hikes. After setting up a small shelter to protect me from the wind and any moisture, I crawled inside. I pulled out my emergency blanket and wrapped it around me. The temperature was dropping fast. The forest, which had seemed inviting in the daylight, now felt cold and unforgiving. I checked my water supply and ate some energy bars to keep my strength up. Then I sat as still as I could, listening to the night sounds. Cracking branches, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. The darkness around me felt thick and heavy. I tried not to think about how isolated I was or how vulnerable I felt. I forced myself to breathe slowly and stay calm. The night was long and uncomfortable. My ankle throbbed constantly, making it hard to sleep. I kept scanning the forest edges with my headlamp, half expecting to see other hikers or some sign of help. But nothing came, just the endless dark and quiet. At some point, I heard the faint sound of footsteps, soft, careful, but definitely human. My heart raced. I wondered if someone had seen my car at the trailhead and come looking. I strained to listen, but the sounds faded away as quickly as they had come. I hoped it was someone who might come back. Morning was a relief. The sky lightened slowly, bringing some warmth back to the forest. I unwrapped myself and tried to assess my ankle. It was swollen and stiff, but I knew I had to move. Sitting there wasn't safe or practical. I decided to try to hike back to the trailhead, even if it meant crawling if necessary. I used my hiking poles, which I had thankfully brought, to support myself. Step by slow step, I made my way back along the creek. The trail was still hard to see, and I had to use my compass often to stay on course. My muscles ached from the effort, but I kept going. After several hours, I reached the fork where I had chosen the mining camp path the day before. Relief flooded me when I saw the familiar markers. From there, the trail was clearer and easier. I rested briefly, ate some food, and prepared for the last stretch. The forest opened up as I neared the trailhead. I could hear distant cars and voices. My spirits lifted, and I pushed myself harder despite the pain. Finally, I saw my car parked where I had left it. The sight was like a lifeline. I collapsed into the driver's seat, exhausted and sore, but incredibly grateful to be safe. I called for help once I got a weak signal, explaining my injury and location. Rescue came later that day. The experience taught me many things about preparation, patience, and survival. Most importantly, it showed me that nature is beautiful but also unpredictable. The forest that had been so peaceful and inviting in the daylight turned into a cold and unforgiving place at night, especially when injured and alone. Since then, I always carry more safety gear, never hike alone without telling someone my plan, and respect the wilderness more than ever. That hike remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of how real and raw the danger was. I had always liked hiking alone. It was a way to get away from everything: the noise, the crowds, the endless chatter of people. The mountains near my hometown had plenty of trails, some easy, some hard, but I liked the ones that felt a little wild and untouched. The kind where you could get lost if you didn't pay attention, but that was part of the appeal. I liked the challenge and I liked the silence. One weekend in late fall, I decided to hike a trail I had never tried before. It was called the Pine Ridge Trail. I had heard about it from a few local hikers online. They said it was beautiful, with great views and not too crowded. The trailhead was a couple hours from my apartment, so I left early on a Saturday morning. The sky was clear, the air cool and fresh. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and my map. I always carried a map, even though I had a GPS on my phone. I didn't want to rely only on technology, especially in the woods. The trail started off easy. It followed a narrow dirt path through tall pine trees, with sunlight streaming down through the branches. The smell of pine needles filled the air, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. I felt calm and focused. The trail was marked with orange blazes on the trees, spaced every few hundred feet. I followed them carefully, stopping now and then to check my map and get my bearings. After about an hour, the trail started to climb steadily. The path became steeper and rockier, winding up the side of a ridge. The trees grew thinner here, and I could see the valley below through the gaps in the branches. The wind picked up cool and sharp. I paused for a break, drinking some water and eating a granola bar. I looked around, enjoying the view, feeling good about being out here alone. I put my pack back on and kept going. The trail curved around the ridge, leading into a thicker forest. The trees here were older, with trunks as wide as a man's arm. The ground was covered with a thick layer of pine needles and dry leaves. The light was dimmer here, filtered through the dense canopy above. The trail was harder to follow now. The orange blazes were fewer and farther between. I started to pay more attention. About 45 minutes later, I came to a small clearing. The sun was shining through a gap in the trees, lighting up a patch of ferns and moss-covered rocks. I stopped to take a photo. As I lifted my camera, I noticed something strange. The orange blaze on the tree across the clearing looked different. It was faded, almost like it had been painted over or scratched away. I stepped closer and saw that someone had carved initials into the bark below it. They were old and weathered, but I could make out JW and a date, 1987. I felt a slight chill. It was odd to see something so old out here, almost like someone had been hiding or passing through this area long ago. I shrugged it off and took the photo. Then I looked back at the trail, trying to spot the next blaze. That's when I realized I couldn't find it. I looked carefully around the clearing's edge. No orange blaze, no trail, just thick forest and underbrush. My heart started to beat a little faster. I pulled out my map and checked my location. According to it, the trail should continue on the other side of the clearing, heading northeast up the ridge. I stepped forward into the forest, looking for any sign of a path. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches and leaves. I pushed through some small bushes, and then I spotted what might be a faint trail, a narrow line in the dirt where the leaves looked disturbed. I breathed a little easier and started to follow it, but the trail soon disappeared again. Now I was walking in almost complete silence, except for the sound of my boots crunching dry leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. The trees around me were tall and close together, their trunks casting long shadows in the afternoon light. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. The forest felt bigger than it had before, as if it was closing in on me. I stopped to take a deep breath. I told myself I was just tired, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks. The map showed the trail was supposed to be here. I had to keep going. I kept moving, trying to look for any sign of a blaze or a worn path. I noticed some broken branches low on the trees, as if someone had brushed past recently. Maybe a deer or some other animal. That thought made me feel a little better. This was nature. I wasn't alone, but I was safe. After about 20 minutes of wandering, I saw a fallen tree across the ground. Its trunk was thick, and it looked like it had been down for a while, covered in moss and mushrooms. I climbed over it carefully, and as I did, my foot caught on something. I stumbled and almost fell. I looked down and saw a small metal object half buried in the dirt. I bent down and picked it up. It was an old key, rusty and heavy. It looked like it had been buried in the forest floor for years. I held it in my hand, turning it over. Why was it here? What lock did it open? A weird thought crossed my mind. Was I close to some old cabin or shed? I decided to keep the key. Felt like a strange souvenir. I walked on. The light was fading now, and the forest was starting to get dark and quiet. I checked my watch. It was almost 5 p.m. I wanted to make it back to the trailhead before dark. I needed to find the main trail again. I kept moving forward, trying to follow my map and compass. But the forest felt different now. The trees looked older, the branches twisted and bare in places. The ground was wetter and muddier. I saw no blazes anywhere, The trail was gone. A few times, I thought I heard sounds. Maybe footsteps or the rustle of leaves behind me. I stopped and listened hard. Nothing, just the wind. My heart pounded. I was lost. I tried to stay calm. I pulled out my phone to check GPS. No signal, no bars at all. The battery was about half full, but without a signal, it was useless. I took a deep breath. The sun was low now. I had to decide. Keep moving forward in the hope of finding the trail, or turn back the way I came. I thought about turning back, but if I couldn't find the trail going forward, could I find it going backward? I wasn't sure. The last thing I wanted was to wander in circles. I decided to try going forward a little longer, looking for anything that might help me get my bearings. After another 10 minutes, I came across a small stream. It was clear and cold, running downhill between the trees. I knelt and drank some water, grateful for the small break. I looked up and down the stream, hoping to see some sign of a path or a clearing. On the far side of the stream, I spotted something dark between the trees. It looked like a piece of fabric caught on a branch. I stood up and moved closer carefully, stepping over wet rocks. As I got nearer, I saw it was part of a backpack, old, torn, faded green canvas. I tugged gently on the strap and it came free. The backpack was empty except for a crumpled plastic water bottle and a worn-out notebook. I opened the notebook carefully. The pages were yellowed and water-stained. Inside were notes and sketches, written in messy handwriting. Some pages had names and dates, all from years ago. The notes described the forest, the trail, and the wildlife. One page stood out. It was a warning about the trail, that sometimes, especially in the fall, the orange blazes would fade or be covered by moss and leaves, making it easy to lose the way. The writer said they had gotten lost once but managed to find a ranger's cabin hidden deep in the woods. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there really was a cabin out here, a real place where I could find help or at least shelter. I put the notebook back and picked up the backpack. I looked around, trying to decide which way to go. Then I heard a noise behind me, a low, steady rustling, like branches breaking. I spun around, heart racing. There was nothing, just trees. I shook my head, trying to calm down. Maybe an animal, a deer or a raccoon. I decided to follow the stream downhill. Water always leads to civilization or a road, I thought. It was better than wandering aimlessly. The stream narrowed and deepened as I walked alongside it. The ground grew slippery and steep. I had to be careful not to fall. The sun was almost gone now. The forest was darkening fast. Suddenly, I tripped on a root and fell hard onto the wet ground. My knee scraped badly, bleeding through my pants. I bit my lip, pushing away the sharp pain. I pulled out my first aid kit, cleaned the wound as best as I could, and wrapped it with a bandage. I sat for a moment, feeling exhausted. My backpack felt heavier now. My legs ached. The cold was creeping in. I told myself I had to keep going. After about an hour of following the stream, the forest began to open up. The trees thinned out, and I heard the distant hum of cars. I followed the sound, moving faster. Eventually, I reached a small dirt road. It was narrow and cracked, but it was a road. I walked along it for a while, hoping to find a house or a ranger station. After about 20 minutes, I saw a small wooden cabin with a porch and a parked pickup truck. I approached slowly and knocked on the door. A man in I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My work schedule had been crushing me lately, and I was desperate to get out of the city and spend a few days somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could hear my own thoughts without the sound of traffic, people, and the constant vibration of my phone. Hiking had always been my escape, and I'd been planning a solo route through a section of forest I hadn't explored before. It was remote but still within reach of a small rural town, and the trail wasn't too popular. That was part of the appeal. I wanted open space, no crowds, and the feeling of being away from everything. The plan was simple. Park near the trailhead early in the morning, hike up into the hills, follow the trail for about 20 miles over 2 days, camp overnight somewhere off the main path, and make the loop back by the afternoon of the second day. I had all my gear packed the night before: tent, sleeping bag, compact stove, food for 2 days, first aid kit, extra clothing, GPS device, compass, and a printed map in case the electronics failed. I wasn't new to this. I knew what to bring and how to pace myself. That morning, the sky was clear, but there was a thin bite in the air, the kind that makes your breath visible. I parked in the gravel lot by the trailhead. There was only one other car there, an older sedan, but I didn't see anyone around. I figured they'd either started early or had gone in on a different trail. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, adjusted the straps until it felt snug and balanced, then started walking. The first mile was gentle, a gradual incline with wide dirt paths framed by tall pines. The forest smelled sharp and clean, and the ground was soft with fallen needles. The sun was low, slipping through the branches in strips of gold. I could hear the faint rush of a creek somewhere below. It was the kind of setting that made me forget everything I'd been stressed about. As the trail wound higher, it narrowed and the trees grew closer together. There were long sections where the forest floor was uneven, with roots twisting up like knotted ropes. I stopped once or twice to drink from my water bottle and check my map, but everything matched up. The first few hours passed without a problem. By noon, I reached a ridge that opened into a view of rolling hills and deep valleys, the kind of sight that makes you stop without realizing it. The wind was cooler up there, carrying the smell of wet leaves from somewhere below. I sat for a while, ate a granola bar, and just looked out. It was perfect. The trail beyond the ridge started to drop again, zigzagging through denser sections of trees. This was where the ground got trickier: loose soil, occasional rocks, and patches where the trail wasn't as well maintained. At one point, I had to carefully step over a section that had partially eroded, leaving a sloping drop into a dry creek bed. A little after midday, I came to a fork that wasn't marked on my printed map. One path was wide and clear, the other was narrow, more overgrown, and angled sharply downward. My GPS showed both, but the narrower one seemed to cut directly toward a clearing I'd marked as a good camping spot. It would shave off an hour. I hesitated, thinking about the old advice to stick to the main trail, but I'd taken shortcuts before without issue. The weather was steady, I had plenty of daylight, and I figured it would be fine. The shortcut started well enough, though it was steeper than I expected. My boots slid a little on loose dirt, and I had to keep one hand free to brace myself on trees. The sound of the creek got louder, and soon I could see it glinting between the trees below. But the path got narrower still, and it started to curve in strange, uneven ways, as if it hadn't been used much in years. That's when I noticed something: the quiet. I mean, the forest is never truly silent, but here the usual background noise of birds and wind seemed muffled. I could hear the creek, but it felt far away now, even though I could still see parts of it. The trail became rougher. Branches clawed at my jacket, and I had to step over fallen logs that looked like they'd been there for years. I began to realize that this wasn't a maintained path at all. It was probably just a game trail that had been picked up by my GPS as a route. I stopped to decide whether to turn back, but the slope behind me looked worse to climb up than what was ahead. I told myself it would level out soon. After another 20 minutes, the path disappeared completely. It was just leaves and undergrowth now. My GPS still showed I was moving toward the clearing, but the ground here was uneven, full of hidden holes under the leaves. I slowed down, testing each step. Then I heard it, a sharp crack somewhere behind me. Not a twig snapping, but the heavy sound of something stepping on dry wood. I froze. My first thought was that it was a deer, maybe even a bear. My pulse quickened. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. Just still trunks and the dark spaces between them. I kept walking, but now I was more alert, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The sound came again, closer this time. 2 steps, then nothing. I stopped and crouched slightly, trying to see movement in the underbrush. Nothing. I waited maybe 30 seconds, but it felt longer. Then I heard another step, but from a slightly different direction. I told myself it was probably an animal curious about me. Still, I gripped my trekking pole tighter and moved faster. The ground sloped sharply down toward the creek now, and I decided to head straight for the water instead of following the GPS. I figured that once I hit the creek, I could follow it until I reached the main trail again. The slope got worse, and I had to slide down sections on my heels. My legs were starting to burn, and my pack felt heavier. I could hear the water much louder now. I was maybe 50 yards from it when I heard movement behind me again, faster this time. I spun around just in time to catch a flicker of something. A shape, low to the ground, darting behind a tree. That was enough for me. I pushed downhill as fast as I could without falling, branches whipping against my arms. My boots hit mud, and suddenly I was at the edge of the creek. The water was shallow, running over smooth stones, but the bank on the far side was steep. I waded in, the cold biting through my socks instantly, and scrambled up the other side, grabbing handfuls of roots to pull myself up. Once I was across, I stopped to listen. My breathing was loud in my ears, but underneath it, I thought I heard something splash in the water I just crossed. I didn't wait to see. I headed upstream, moving as quickly as I could, scanning for any sign of the main trail. The sun was starting to drop, and the forest shadows grew longer. My GPS battery was already low from constant use, and I knew I didn't have much time before I'd be navigating by map and compass alone. After about half an hour, I finally spotted the worn dirt of the main trail through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop walking until I was well past that section and could no longer hear the creek. I camped that night in the clearing I'd originally planned on, but I barely slept. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves had me wide awake, gripping my knife. I didn't hear footsteps again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been following me hadn't lost interest, only lost sight of me. The next morning, I packed up before the sun was fully up and made my way back along the main trail, moving faster than I normally would. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. That other sedan from yesterday was gone. I loaded my gear into the trunk, got behind the wheel, and didn't look back until I was miles away. Even now, I can't say for certain what it was that followed me. Maybe it was just a curious animal. Maybe it wasn't. But I know this: I won't take unmarked trails again, no matter how much time they promise to save. Out there, being watched is bad enough. Not knowing by what is worse. It was early morning when I set out on the trail. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of freshness that feels like a clean slate. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks, an escape from the city noise, a chance to be alone with nature. The forest had always been a place I found peace, a place where my thoughts slowed down and the worries I carried felt smaller. I chose a trail in the national forest about 3 hours from my home. It was supposed to be a moderate hike, around 8 miles round trip, with some steep parts but nothing too crazy. The weather forecast said clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect for hiking. I packed my bag the night before, making sure I had plenty of water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, and my phone fully charged. I was confident and ready. As I arrived at the trailhead, I noticed the parking lot was almost empty, except for a few cars. That felt right. I liked it when trails weren't crowded. I strapped on my backpack, checked my gear one last time, and stepped onto the dirt path. The forest was quiet, except for the soft rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. The first mile was easy. The path wound gently uphill, surrounded by tall pines and firs. The smell of pine needles filled the air. I felt good, my legs warm, and my breath steady. I saw a few squirrels darting across the trail, and a couple of rabbits hopping through the underbrush. It was peaceful. After about 2 miles, the trail began to climb more steeply. The trees thinned out, and I could see patches of blue sky between the branches. The sunlight broke through in golden beams, casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. My heart rate picked up, but I welcomed the challenge. I kept a steady pace, focusing on placing my feet carefully over the loose rocks and roots. Around the 3rd mile, I reached a small clearing near the top of a ridge. The view was incredible. The valley below stretched out in all directions, covered in a blanket of green trees. Farther away, Jagged mountain peaks rose sharply against the sky. I paused to catch my breath and drink some water, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I checked my watch. I was right on schedule. I decided to push a little farther, hoping to reach a small lake I had read about on the map. It was supposed to be a hidden gem, only visible to hikers who took a side path near the ridge. I continued uphill, following the narrow trail that curved around a rocky outcrop. The forest here was thinner still, with only a few scattered bushes and grasses growing between stones. The wind had picked up, making a low moaning sound as it slipped through the trees. It was cold now, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Then the trail split. The main path continued straight, but a thinner, less worn trail veered off to the right, heading downhill. According to my map, that was the way to the lake. I took out my phone to check the GPS signal. It was weak, but I could see the little blue dot moving slowly along the smaller trail. I started down. The path was steeper and more uneven. The dirt was loose, and my boots kicked up small clouds of dust. I had to focus on each step. The forest was eerily quiet here. No birds, no animals. Just the sound of my breathing and the occasional crack of a twig beneath my feet. I didn't see any other hikers. That was fine. I liked the solitude. After about 20 minutes, the trail suddenly ended at a small, rocky ledge overlooking a deep ravine. Below, I could see the glint of water, a narrow stream winding its way through the rocks. But there was no sign of the lake. I took a closer look at the map. I must have missed the turn. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of the path. On the far side of the ravine, I spotted what looked like a faint trail leading down toward the water. It was barely visible, overgrown with bushes and vines. The thought of crossing the ravine to find the lake made my stomach twist. The slope was steep and covered in loose stones, but I was curious. I wanted to see the lake, so I carefully climbed down the rocky slope toward the faint trail. The ground was unstable beneath my feet, and I moved slowly, testing each step. The wind was stronger here, whipping around the rocks and making me shiver. The shadows were longer now. The sun was starting to sink behind the mountains. I reached the bottom near the stream. The water was cold and clear, bubbling over smooth stones. The faint trail continued along the bank, twisting through thick bushes. I followed it, hoping it would lead to the lake. But after a few minutes, the path disappeared entirely. The bushes grew thicker, the ground wet and muddy. I realized the trail was more of an animal track than a proper path. It was difficult to walk, and I had to push branches and brambles aside to move forward. The sky was dimming fast. I didn't want to be stuck here after dark. I turned back, retracing my steps toward the ravine's edge. The climb back up was harder than I thought. The loose stones shifted beneath my weight, and I had to use my hands to steady myself. My gloves were torn by the sharp rocks. When I finally reached the top, I felt relief wash over me. I was safe again. I looked at my watch. The light was fading quickly. I had to head back before it got too dark. I started the hike down the main trail, keeping a steady pace. The forest around me grew darker and colder. The wind was picking up again, and I pulled my hood over my head. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The trail didn't feel right. The trees looked unfamiliar. I stopped and checked my map. According to it, I should have been on a straight path back to the parking lot. But the trees here were thick and close together. I couldn't see the open clearing I remembered from the morning. I looked at my phone to check the GPS, but the battery was low, less than 10%, and the signal was gone. Panic began to creep in. I had been careful with my phone, but I had used it more than I thought. No service, no way to call for help. I tried to stay calm and backtrack, but the trail wasn't clear. I stumbled over roots and rocks, feeling my legs grow tired and shaky. The shadows pressed in around me, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a leaf, felt loud and threatening. I took a deep breath and kept moving. I remembered I had a flashlight in my pack. I stopped, pulled it out, and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness ahead, showing the rough dirt path. It wasn't marked with any signs, but I hoped it was the way back. Time passed slowly. The sun had set, but the moon was bright and full, lighting the forest in a pale silver. Still, the forest felt alive with noises, hoots of distant owls, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the brush. My legs ached, my back was sore, and my stomach was empty. I had eaten most of my snacks earlier, not wanting to slow down. My water bottle was almost empty too. After what felt like hours, I came to a small stream crossing. I recognized it from the map. Relief flooded through me. I was close to the parking lot. I followed the stream downhill. The path was muddy and slippery. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. A heavy footstep on wet leaves. I froze. I turned my head slowly, shining my flashlight back the way I had come. Nothing, just trees. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or something bigger, but I tried not to think about it. I kept walking faster now. The footstep noise came again, closer this time. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest, lungs burning. The path was uneven and I tripped over a root, scraping my knee badly. I fell hard, pain sharp and immediate. I scrambled up, tears stinging my eyes, and ran faster, hearing the footsteps behind me again. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I reached the edge of the forest and saw the faint glow of car headlights in the distance. The parking lot. With one last burst of energy, I sprinted out of the trees and into the open. I never looked back. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside, shaking. I caught my breath, checked my phone. Still no service, but the battery was almost dead. I started the engine and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror. The trees of the forest faded into the darkness behind me, silent and still. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, where I bought a charger and some food. I called a friend from the station and told them where I had been. The next day, I went back with park rangers to look for the trail and the lake. They told me that part of the forest was known for poor trail markings and was easy to get lost in. The side path to the lake was not an official trail at all. It was an old animal path that sometimes disappeared. They said other hikers had gotten lost in the same area before, some injured by the steep terrain or slipping on loose rocks. I was lucky. I survived because I stayed calm enough to find my way out and because I made it to the parking lot before dark. I didn't want to think about what could have happened if I hadn't. Since that hike, I haven't returned to that trail. I still love hiking, but I'm more careful now. I never take risks. I had been planning the hike for months. It wasn't one of those casual day walks people take just to stretch their legs. This was supposed to be a multi-day trip through a remote part of the mountains that almost no one visited outside of hunting season. I had read about the Ridge Trail from an old online forum post buried deep in a thread about forgotten trails. The writer had described it as tough but beautiful, with narrow cliffside paths, steep ascents, and valleys that felt untouched. That was exactly what I wanted. Something difficult, quiet, and far from anyone else. I picked late summer because the weather would be warm but not unbearable, and the snow up high would have melted enough to make the passes safer. I checked the maps over and over, trying to memorize the turns and the distances between the few water sources. I packed carefully, light but with enough gear to keep me safe if something went wrong. I told myself I was ready. The first day started well. I drove my old truck to a dirt pull-off about 20 miles from the nearest small town. The sun was just rising when I parked, painting the sky a soft orange. I strapped on my pack, checked my water, and stepped onto the narrow trail. The forest swallowed me quickly, the sound of my boots crunching on dry soil blending with the faint rustle of leaves above. For hours, the trail climbed gently, winding between tall pines and patches of dense undergrowth. Every now and then I caught glimpses of the valley far below, with a thin ribbon of river glinting in the distance. The air smelled of pine resin and dry earth. I barely saw any wildlife except for a squirrel darting across the trail and a hawk circling high above. I felt good, strong, and eager to push on. By midday, I reached a rocky outcrop that gave me a view of the ridge I'd be following for the next 2 days. It rose sharply ahead, jagged and steep, with bare rock faces catching the sun. There was no sign of anyone else. I ate a quick lunch, their jerky, nuts, and a bit of dried fruit before shouldering my pack again and heading upward. The climb was harder than I expected. Loose stones slid under my boots, and the trail narrowed until I had to hug the rock wall on my right while the slope dropped sharply to my left. My legs burned with each step, but I liked that feeling. It meant I was working for the view, for the quiet. I stopped to drink from my bottle and watched clouds forming far away over the next valley. That first night, I camped in a small clearing just below the ridge line. I set up my small tent, cooked a simple meal on my stove, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. The air turned cool quickly. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the faint sigh of wind through the branches, and drifted off. The next morning, I woke to a thin layer of frost on the tent. The ridge trail ran steeply upward, and I moved slowly, pacing myself. As I climbed, the trees thinned, replaced by low shrubs and patches of bare stone. I could see for miles now deep valleys on both sides, the trail winding like a pale scar along the ridge's spine. It was around midday on the second day when I noticed something that made me pause. The trail ahead had fresh boot prints in the dust. At first, I thought maybe they were my own from the morning before, but the spacing was wrong. These prints were longer, wider, and more defined, like someone carrying a heavier load. I told myself it wasn't strange. Other hikers used the trail sometimes. Still, I hadn't seen anyone since I'd started, and the prints looked recent. As the hours passed, I saw more signs. A crushed patch of grass just off the trail, a broken branch that looked freshly snapped. Once, I thought I caught the faint smell of cigarette smoke, but the wind shifted before I could be sure. I walked faster without really meaning to. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in, casting shadows over the ridge. I wanted to make it to a small tarn marked on my map before dark so I'd have water for the night. The trail dipped slightly into a shallow saddle, and that's where I found it, an old campsite. The fire ring was cold but recent, the ashes scattered like they'd been kicked out that morning. There was a small pile of trash shoved into the rocks, an empty can, a plastic wrapper. Not the careful kind of camp a regular hiker would leave. I didn't stay long. I filled my bottles from the tarn, filtered the water, and climbed a bit farther up the ridge until I found a spot that felt more hidden from the trail. I pitched my tent behind a cluster of low pines, ate quickly, and crawled inside. The wind rose during the night, rattling the tent walls. Every time I half drifted into sleep, a gust would pull me back awake. On the third morning, I moved slower. The trail ahead was the narrowest section yet, bare rock with sheer drops on either side. I had to place each step carefully, gripping the rock when the wind gusted too hard. My mind kept going back to those boot prints, to the campsite, to the cigarette smell. I told myself it didn't matter, but my stomach felt tight all the same. By midday, I reached a steep descent into a wooded valley. The trail wound sharply back and forth, switchback after switchback, until I was surrounded by tall firs again. The air here was still, almost too still after the ridge. It was then, moving along one of the lower switchbacks, that I heard the faint sound of something moving through the brush above me. It was slow, deliberate. I stopped, my heart thudding, and looked up through the trees. I didn't see anything, but the sound stopped too. I waited a long minute before moving again, slower now. For the rest of the day, I felt that sensation of being just barely watched. I would glance behind me, seeing only empty trail, then hear a soft crack of a twig somewhere too far to place. I pushed on until I reached a stream and decided to camp nearby, more out of exhaustion than choice. That night was worse. I lay in my bag, listening to every sound outside the tent. At one point, I was sure I heard soft footfalls in the dirt, just beyond the thin nylon walls. I held my breath until they faded. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I packed quickly and started down the valley toward the trailhead. The air was damp, and mist clung to the trees. My legs ached from the days of climbing and descending, but I kept a steady pace. Around mid-morning, I stopped to drink from my bottle and noticed movement ahead, just a flicker of motion behind a tree. When I looked again, it was gone. I didn't think any more about taking breaks. I just walked, faster and faster, until I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool air. The trail bent around a fallen log, and that's when I saw it boot prints again, clear and deep in the soft dirt, headed the same way I was going. They weren't more than an hour old. I kept going, scanning the trail ahead, my breath quick and shallow. The forest felt tighter, the trees leaning in. Once, I thought I heard the sound of fabric brushing against bark, but it faded before I could place it. By the time I reached the dirt road where my truck was parked, the sun was low, and the sky was a dull gray. My hands shook as I unlocked the door. I didn't look back down the trail. I just started the engine and drove, the gravel spitting under my tires. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees. That night, in the small motel room I rented in the nearest town, I sat on the bed with the lights on, replaying every detail in my mind: the prints, the sounds, the cigarette smell. Someone had been up there with me the whole time. Maybe just another hiker, maybe not. I would never know. I haven't been back to the Ridge Trail since. I had planned the hike for weeks. I had been studying trail maps, checking weather reports, and reading online forums about the Ridge Trail in the northern part of the state. It wasn't the most famous route, but it had a reputation for being remote, rugged, and long. I wanted something that would push me, something that would give me a real test of endurance. I didn't have friends who enjoyed this kind of thing, so, like many of my hikes, this one would be solo. The Ridge Trail Loop was just over 22 miles if you took it from the south entrance and followed it clockwise. It cut through steep switchbacks, rocky inclines, and narrow ridges before dipping into deep, wooded valleys. In most areas, there was no cell service. The trail had side paths and offshoots that weren't always marked, which meant navigation had to be careful. It was known to be quiet out there, the kind of quiet where you could hike for hours without seeing another person. I left home just before sunrise, my car loaded with my backpack, trekking poles, and enough food and water for the whole day, plus extra in case something went wrong. The air outside was still cool when I reached the trailhead. My breath was visible, hanging in small clouds as I stepped out and began unloading my gear. The parking lot was small and gravel-covered. Only one other vehicle was there, a dusty green SUV with mud streaks along the doors. I noticed it because it looked like it had been there for a while. The windows were fogged slightly from the inside, like maybe it had been driven recently but was now sitting idle. I adjusted my pack, making sure the straps hugged my shoulders evenly. The first part of the trail was narrow, weaving through dense undergrowth. The morning light broke through the leaves in thin golden beams, catching on spider webs strung between low branches. I tried to set a steady pace, knowing the trail's difficulty would increase later on. My boots crunched over gravel and loose soil, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness. About 45 minutes in, the air grew warmer, and I removed my light jacket, tying it around my waist. The trail wound upward, climbing toward the ridge's lower slopes. My calves burned slightly, but I welcomed the feeling it meant I was warming up. I passed a faded wooden trail marker pointing left for the Ridge Trail Loop and right for a fire access road. I stuck to the loop. The climb grew steeper. Loose stones rolled under my boots, forcing me to plant my trekking poles carefully. When I stopped for a sip of water, I turned to look back down the trail. From this height, I could see the valley floor spread out below, covered in endless forest, the morning mist still hanging over it like a blanket. The sight was peaceful, almost hypnotic. By mid-morning, the trail narrowed to a point where both sides dropped away sharply. To the left, the ground fell away into a steep wooded ravine. To the right, it dropped into a deep, shadowy gorge. The ridge itself was only about 5 feet wide in places, with loose rock and uneven ground. I slowed my pace here, making sure each step was secure. That was when I noticed something unusual. Ahead, near a bend in the ridge, the dirt looked disturbed, like someone had kicked at it or dragged something across it. I thought it could be from an animal, but as I got closer, I saw deep boot prints. They weren't fresh, maybe a day or two old, but they had an odd, irregular pattern, like whoever made them had been limping or carrying something heavy. I didn't think much of it at first, but a mile or so later, I saw more. This time, the prints were mixed with small bits of torn fabric caught on a low, sharp branch. The cloth was dark, maybe from a shirt or pants. I crouched to look closer and saw a faint smear of something brown on the branch. I told myself it could be dried mud, but my stomach tightened anyway. I kept moving. The trail dipped into a shaded hollow where the temperature dropped noticeably. My skin prickled from the cool air. The sound of my footsteps seemed louder here, and the stillness had an almost oppressive weight. It was the kind of silence where you start to notice your own breathing, the faint hum in your ears, the way the straps of your backpack creak when you shift your shoulders. I ate lunch sitting on a flat boulder overlooking a stream that cut through the valley. I didn't linger long because I wanted to make the higher ridge section before mid-afternoon. That stretch was the hardest, jagged rock, loose shale, and almost no flat ground for over a mile. When I reached it, the wind picked up, funneling through the gaps in the ridge, pulled at my clothes and hissed in my ears. I focused on placing each step carefully. About halfway across, I spotted something down in the trees to my left. It was hard to make out through the branches, but it looked like a small tarp or tent, dark blue, maybe 20 or 30 yards off the trail. I wondered if it was a campsite. I considered checking it out, but decided against it. It was far off trail, and I didn't want to risk losing my route. Still, as I moved on, I couldn't help glancing back. The blue shape was barely visible through the trees, unmoving. Not long after, I began noticing sounds. Very faint, almost like fabric rustling or small rocks shifting. First, I thought it was just the wind, but several times, when the wind died down, I could still hear it, a soft, irregular crunch of something on the trail behind me. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped too. By late afternoon, I was in the northern section of the loop, the most isolated part. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to push through tall grass and low-hanging branches. I felt more aware of every noise, a twig snapping somewhere off to my right, the faint crackle of leaves underfoot somewhere behind. At one point, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a flicker of something pale slipping between two trees. I turned sharply, but there was nothing. The forest stood still. My pace quickened without me meaning to. I told myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of hiking alone all day. But my body felt tense. My shoulders were tight, my grip on the trekking poles firmer. The sun was lowering now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I still had several miles to go before I'd be back at the trailhead. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trail behind me. Once, I thought I saw the same irregular boot prints again, faint in the dirt. When I reached the last big descent toward the parking lot, my legs were tired, but adrenaline was keeping me alert. The trail here zigzagged down a steep slope with thick brush on both sides. The air felt warmer again, heavier. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Halfway down, I heard a quick, heavy set of footsteps above me, then silence. I froze, my chest tightening. I scanned the slope above, but the trees and brush were too thick to see anything clearly. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now. The parking lot came into view through the trees, and I felt a flicker of relief. But when I stepped out of the trailhead, I stopped. The same green SUV was still there, only now it was parked in a slightly different spot, angled toward the trail entrance. My own car was untouched, but as I unlocked it, I noticed something that made my stomach drop in the layer of dust on the driver's side door. There was a clear streak where someone had dragged their hand across, leaving 4 long finger marks. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine without hesitation. As I drove away, I checked my mirrors again and again. No one followed. I never went back to the ridge trail,